Hello everyone, welcome to Midwestern Marx. My name is Carlos Garrido. Today what I'm going to be doing is teaching you about Marcuse's critique of one-dimensional philosophy. So I'm going to be hitting on 6 central points that I see as the most important ones in his critique. And afterwards, I'm going to analyze it shortly. I don't plan on spending too much time in the analysis, but yeah, let's get into it. Part 1. Therapeutic function of the one-dimensional philosophical analysis. The reigning philosophy in one-dimensional society has as its goal the reducing of philosophical phenomena to what can be concretely seen and quantified. This process is described as therapeutic, given that it seeks to alleviate wrongful thought, which deals with transcendental obscurities, illusions, and oddities. The patient of the therapist is, of course, the nonconformist intellectual, or more generally, whoever dares to examine not just mutilated facts, but the factors which allowed those facts to be. It is a philosophy which, to define it both negatively and positively, decontextualizes and reifies. It removes the historical, ideological, and more generally contextual elements that precede or determine the phenomena examined, to then examine that phenomena as a reality separated from the reality that made it real. In essence, in removing an experience from its general context, the experience is made into a thing. It is reified and subject to quantification. This self-proclaimed non-ideological approach to philosophy is only non-ideological insofar as ideology comes to mean anything that goes against the one-dimensionality of the existing order. With the existing order being non-ideological, its philosophical theorists thus present themselves as the beacons of objectivity, excluding anything that goes against the grain as ideological. This form of positive thinking is not limited to philosophy. Sociologically, he demonstrates too that when workplaces are analyzed, instead of showing a systematic analysis of the general condition experienced by workers, what is demonstrated is that is a condition in which each workplace is tried to analyze individually. Within philosophy itself, this trend is not limited to rationalist or empiricist camps. Both engaged with a particular reality disconnected from that which makes it real and treat the dismembered reality as the reality. Part 2. Historical development of positivism. Marcuse dates positivism back to Saint Simon. This positivism conceived of knowledge as that which orients cognitive thought towards the physical sciences and quantifiable exactness, validating all thought through experience and facts. Thus, from its inception, positivism is a struggle against that which transcends the empirically verifiable. It is a fight against idealism, metaphysics, and transcendentalisms. In its inceptions, there is thus a certain radicalism to positivism. The order of society is metaphysical, and their science drive pushes them to a critical position with their appeal to experimental affirmation. Saint Simon, for example, is considered one of, if not the first, of modern utopian socialists. Hume's early positivism, or traditional empiricism, radically challenged the reigning Newtonian physics. Modern positivism, on the other hand, exists in a world in which its methodology is central in legitimizing the worth of things. As such, similarly to the bourgeois class in the French revolutions of 1789 all the way up to 1830, they find themselves as radical, but when 1848 comes around, they are a conservative force. Thus, when bourgeois society comes to sustain the logic of positivism to its core, any semblance of radicalism from the positivist camp dissipates. They are now tasked with the theoretically conservative role of affirming in a manner that does not simply just empirically verify, but ideologically legitimates. Part 3. The non-transcendental abstraction of one-dimensional philosophy. In the schema of taking things as they are given, the positivist and the linguist, trying to pure themselves from abstraction, abstract, legitimate, and aid in hegemonizing the existing order. Marcuse gives the example of the linguist, who sees in common street language the expression of material reality. While the linguist believes to be dealing with concrete reality, he is actually dealing with a false concreteness that stems from a purged language. While claiming to be non-abstract, the linguist approaches empirical data and discourse with an a priori set of ideological prejudices. The linguist is blinded to this because they remove the historical, contextual, and ideological conditions out of which the language comes to form itself in the first place. It is a judge who arrives at an arena in the 12th round of a fight that has already had 11 other rounds. No one in their right mind would consider that judging the 12th round is good enough to judge how the whole fight went. The linguist, concerned with the exactness and clarity of their description of concepts, forces them to abstract out of a universe in which the inexactness and obscurity of the concept itself represents the inexactness and opaqueness of a world as disordered as the sentence a person formulates. This abstraction that excludes critical explanations and hypothetical thought for the sake of descriptive thinking puts itself in a straitjacket. Puts thinking in a straitjacket. In the straitjacket, philosophic thought is asphyxiated, all its important concepts are prohibited, for those necessitate a gap, or a realm of the practically unfulfilled, that although theoretically fruitful, and from its fruitful implications possibly practically fulfilling, in itself it remains practically unfulfilled, and thus excluded from the realm of the philosophical linguist's investigation. This sets up self-loathing philosophy. As such, philosophy in the 20th century is in large part the philosophizing of the death of philosophy. Part 4. The exclusion of negative thinking. Negative thinking, as opposed to positive, is courageous enough to step into the ring with contradiction. In a struggle to grasp and battle contradiction, the possibility for growth, both materially and theoretically, come to be. It deals with the world both as it is and how it is formulated through language, not through purged language and false concreteness, but in its holistic approach it creates the conditions for the possibility of having the sort of abstraction that goes from false concreteness to true concreteness. In this negative, critical, or dialectical thinking, not only sees what is presented in its proper context, but also notices what is not presented, that which is repressed and excluded. The true task of philosophy is precisely the opposite of what the linguist, analytical positivist, and neo-positivist postulates. Philosophy cannot limit itself to facts. It cannot judge and describe just what is. It must explicate the historical nature of the fact. Facts arise in a world out of the historical struggle between subjects and objects, between nature and society, and a philosophy that fails to explicate the factors that allow for the existence of the fact cannot sincerely call itself a philosophy. Part 5. From myth to rational and back. Marcuse extends some of these denunciations to speculative critical theory as well. In relation to myth and reason, and to the present ambiguity as to which is which, he states that socialism becomes rational in the 19th century once the primitive truth of the myth, the primary truth of the myth, is translated into sociological terms. But those realistic notions of yesterday appear once again as mythology. To show this, he juxtaposes the real condition of the modern proletariat against the Marxist proletariat assigned with the role of being the historical emancipatory agent. He also juxtaposes the Marxist idea of socialism itself, who he states that when compared to present-day socialism, makes the former look like a dream. All in all, what he is describing is a tension between theory and praxis, one whose separation and proximity is a condition by which we see the theoretical as realistic or mythological. Part 6, and the last part. Blending of the rational and the mystical. Marcuse sees the paradoxical condition of modern society in the fact that ideology comes to be embodied in the process of production itself. In this society, the rational rather than the irrational becomes the most effective vehicle of mystification. Our society is one in which the mystical results from the rational. In essence, irrationality is a rational fabrication. Alright, so there you have it, folks. Those are the 6 central points that I pulled from One Dimensional Man, and specific to his critique of bourgeois theory. So as far as my analysis, I wanted to keep it short as well. I want to say that it is a pretty good critique of the undialectical nature of bourgeois theory. But a lot of these arguments have already been present long ago. Have been present in thinkers like Lukács, have been present in Marx and Engels, and to some extent they have also been present in Lenin and Mao. So I think that although it's quite valuable, the critique that he is producing of bourgeois theory, the real novelty is his ability to describe in his context how far that ideology, that way of thinking, has been able to extend. there's sections in the book where he's talking about how they have been even ingrained into the language, into the way people think. And again, this is something that might have been implicit in the developments of how ideology comes to spread in Marxism, but he's here making it explicit, and he's using this to sort of argue how deep of a hole we're really in ideologically. Now, I have one critique of him, which is really, it can be sort of labeled a general critique of his projects beyond One-Dimensional Man, and also a general critique of the Frankfurt School overall, and really of Western Marxism. And this is that I feel like Marcuse himself, in certain instances, falls into making the flaws that he himself criticizes the bourgeois theorists for doing. And I see this essentially in the way that he equates the world of communism and the capitalist world in the Cold War, so really the USSR and the US. He has this concept of happy consciousness that he critiques, because happy consciousness, which is the sort of consciousness that we have when we live in the sort of Brave New World dystopia, just consuming and consuming and consuming, happy consciousness allows for the comfort necessary to have opportunism. The working class ends up having a whole different culture to the classes that it's antagonistic to, and to the classes that it's not fully antagonistic to. The point is that the society overall ends up having one culture. Remember that the way that Marx never explicitly defines how to think of classes, but he does so implicit in various places, and it's not just the relations that people have to production. That's one part of it, but it's also the sort of lifestyles that they have, and this is seen in more so in his political text, like the 18th Brumaire. So he's saying that the culture has really become one, and the process by which this culture becomes one is through the formation of happy consciousness, which allows for the workers, which in Marx's theory are the revolutionary emancipatory agent, to become a force of opportunism and lose its revolutionary potency. Now, again, this is kind of something that is also in Marx, so it's really not that novel. And that is the fact that in the first of the three manuscripts in 1844, I think it's the first chapter even, or what's put as the first chapter, Marx is describing three possibilities for a capitalist society. There's the possibility of a sort of stagnation. You get to a point where you grow to a sort of almost a maximum. There's declines, in which he says the workers are the ones that are first hit. And then there's stages where there's growth. And when there's growth, the working class to some extent does benefit. But the benefit is really outweighed by the fact that it begins to assimilate the culture of the bourgeois class. It begins to become consumerist, right? So Marx doesn't delve too deeply into this, but this is something that's seen in the first manuscript of the manuscripts of 44. This is also something that Paul Lafargue, his Cuban son-in-law, talks about in The Right to Be Lazy. So this is, again, something that has already been talked about before in Marx, and in this case in Lafargue as well. But again, this concept of happy consciousness is which is central to his critique. He extends to the Soviet Union, and I don't think that's necessarily correct, because on one end, happy consciousness, when interpreted in the context of the US, makes more sense. You have workers who are living relatively well. Again, this book is written in 64. Taft-Hartley is written in 47, so after Taft-Hartley, there's really a drop, but there's still at a level where we have sort of this nice welfare capitalism, or as close as we've been to like a social democracy in the US, right? One job is still enough, and people are able to get cool stuff for the house and all that. But the point is that in capitalism, the reason why this is the case is because there's this over-exploitation of the rest of the world done through imperialism and the new forms of colonization. And thus, this lifestyle, which allows for the happy consciousness, is really built on the backs of the third world that's being exploited and expropriated by the West. Now, this doesn't take away from the fact that a lot of this happy consciousness that he's talking about, a lot of these gains and these comforts were fought for by the working class. These gains weren't just given to them by the owners of society. You know, the boss didn't just say, here, you deserve more money and to go buy X, Y, and Z, right? The promotional element of it was definitely there, but the increase in creating the conditions so that the working class can even have that consumerist lifestyle, which is something that requires a good wage, good benefits, and all of that. Those were things that were fought for by unions, and they were fought for by communists and anarchists and socialists within those unions, right? So I don't want to minimize that, but it's also true that to some extent this is possible because there is this exploitation of the third world. In the case of the Soviet Union and the existing forms of socialism, that is not necessarily the case. You have a very similar level of comfort where people are achieving achieving levels of comfort that were never seen in those societies before. There's the elimination of hunger, of homelessness, illiteracy, or close to eliminations. There's people rising out of poverty by the millions. There's processes of industrialization and people getting healthcare, people getting educations, and a bunch of good stuff going on that's creating what seems to be a similar condition to these developments of happy consciousness and capitalism. But the fact is that you can't compare the two, because when this happens in capitalism, it's done on the backs of the exploitation of the third world, which allows for you to take a little bit of the load of the exploitation of the workers inside the metropole, and thus allows for conditions which might produce a certain form of opportunism. Although again, like I mentioned, you know, a lot of these gains were fought for, right? But in the socialist world, the gains that were made were not done off the backs of imperialism. They were not done off colonialism. The Soviet Union didn't go invade anyone for resources and cheap labor in order to have capital influx back to the Soviet Union. That was the case with the US and with other Western capitalist countries. That wasn't the case with the developing socialist countries. So to juxtapose the two seems pretty bad, right? It seems to be making the same mistake that he is talking about. He looks and he sees, well, here, this society is sort of trying to copy the consumerist culture of the West. Yes, it has improved the conditions of people, but since people here have this happy consciousness that makes them opportunistic, that doesn't allow them to think beyond the system and beyond the one dimension that is created, let's just export this over here. And I don't think that's correct. And that's not correct because it doesn't analyze the conditions of how this comfort came about, which are very different to how it came about in the US, or at least part of how it came about in the US. And it also doesn't analyze these countries in a form that analyzes them dialectically. It doesn't analyze how they came to be. It doesn't analyze the history, the context, the global context, the conditions which force those facts that he's looking at in the socialist world to be facts. He's not looking at the factors. He's not looking at the fact that the world is still dominated by global capital. That global capital is hegemonic both materially and ideologically, and that socialism had to develop with extreme internal and external pressures of economic, military, and ideological nature because of the fact that the empire still had so much power. So again, he's criticizing the bourgeois theory is great, but in the fact that he extends his analysis of the capitalist world and the way that capitalist theorists think to the Soviet Union, in that process, he himself makes the same mistake as those that he is criticizing. This is something that is, like I said, generally done by the Frankfurt School and by a lot of Western Marxists. It's usually done by most people who reject the Soviet Union. And again, we can be critical of socialist states. We should be critical of socialist states, but juxtaposing it to the ideal that Marx presented in Critique of the Gotha Program, it is not a fair way of analyzing things. It's not a Marxist way of analyzing things. You don't use it's not a proper way of using the dialectical materialist framework, which is the method of Marx. When one calls himself a Marxist, you're not tying yourself to the content, you're tying yourself to the method. When you apply it, you get still similar content than when Marx applied it. Because of the nature of society, it's kind of worse. So it's continued the same line. So you get some of the same results, sometimes even more intensified. But where you're tied to is not the content, it's the method. So in these analysis, or in this equating of the one with the other, we have that process of a non-dialectical abstraction and of seeing these socialist states separated from the context which create the possibility for them to really exist. Again, this is something he diagnoses very nicely in the Capitalist Theorist, but this is something that he himself makes the mistake of doing when it comes to interpreting socialism. So I tried to keep this video as short as possible. It's a book that is quite important. I like the book, but I think it's over fetishized sometimes, and it's overrated sometimes. I don't think it's a book that's not worth reading. I think it's worth reading. It's a classic. But yeah, if you enjoyed this, please drop a like, a comment, subscribe to the channel. If you want to help our project out, you can donate financially to Patreon, or you can just share our stuff, and that would help just as well. We have upcoming a print journal of American Socialist Studies, which I believe is the first of its kind. I haven't seen any like it before, trying to popularize the tradition of American socialism to dispel the myth that socialism and America are two completely opposite things. So it's really in the spirit of the Earl Browder quote from the Communist Party that communism is 20th century Americanism, right? So now we're saying that communism or socialism is 21st century Americanism, and let's hope that it works this century, right? So in essence, we have that coming up, and all of the funds that we have on our Patreon are used to fund the project. So the more we have, the more projects we can fund, and the more content we can get out to you, the more educating we can do for the masses, and the more we can push the cause of socialism. So if you made it this long, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day.